The National Association of Counsel for Children advances children's and parents' rights by supporting a diverse, inclusive community of child welfare lawyers to provide zealous legal representation, and by advocating for equitable anti-racist solutions co-designed by people with lived experience. Learn more at naccchildlaw.org, counselforkids.org, and at our National Child Welfare Law Conference in Cleveland this August.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on social media. On July 9th, the Department of Health and Human Services put out what is called a NOFA, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, for organizations that work on the front lines of helping youth who are homeless, have run away, and are either involved in or at risk of being trafficked. That notice came very late in the year and leaves that field of providers really behind the eight ball in competing for funding. And the notice includes a significant change that, at least for this year, ends the standalone street outreach program, which is a key piece of what the federal government invests in every year to help some of the country's most at-risk kids. So we were fortunate enough to have two great guests on to discuss what's going on here. Darla Bardine, longtime executive director of the National Network for Youth, and Barissa Ford, who is the director of community outreach and engagement for youth in need in St. Louis, Missouri. I'll note before we get started, as I did last podcast, this is sort of a developing concern not only with runaway and homeless youth services, but for a lot of funds for youth justice, mentoring, research, etc. We are just about 70 days from the end of the fiscal year right now, if you're listening to this on the week that this podcast comes out. And there are all sorts of funding streams from the federal government where there hasn't even been a notice of funding opportunity yet. So this is definitely something that a lot of people are starting to kind of lock in on and are pretty nervous about the future of 2025 funding. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Darla Bardine and Barissa Ford. We are joined today by Darla Bardine, longtime executive director of the National Network for Youth, and Barissa Ford, who is the director of community outreach and engagement for youth in need in St. Louis, Missouri. And we're going to talk about some concerns over the federal funding picture for runaway and homeless youth, which only recently became available, but with no dedicated path for street outreach, which is one of the main focal points of that program and really the front line of efforts to help youth on the streets or who are unhoused. So thank you guys for joining me on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Before we get into the weighty topics of the day, let me get these listeners to know you a little bit. You both have to give me one favorite in the following categories. You can give me more than that if you want. Movie and TV show, book, musical group, or sports team. Barissa, I'll pick on you and make you go first.
Oh, you made me go first. Okay, well, I'm a sports girl. So for one, I can always talk sports. So love basketball of all sorts. So whether it's NBA, WNBA, college, high school, even toddlers running around playing basketball. So I follow any and all basketball.
Any and all basketball, not even teams, you just watch it.
Yeah, not even teams. Right. The teams thing is hard because I could give you like a favorite team right now, but then all these trades happen. And then the person that I was like, because 2 years ago, I would say the Phoenix Suns were my favorite team.
Okay.
But then that whole team got broken up and they're in everyone's in a totally different team. So do you follow players or do you follow teams?
I'm guessing that means he kind of liked Durant, which I agree with.
I'm actually a Chris Paul fan.
Oh, Chris Paul. Okay. Yeah, fair. Yeah.
The point guard.
Point guard, for sure. All right, Darla, your turn. What do you got for the people on TV or movie, book, sports team, or musical group?
So my favorite, I guess I'll go with music. Soccer is my favorite sport, and we're looking forward to the World Cup. But music, India Ari, Beyonce, and probably Taylor Swift are like top three. Like girl power all the way. That's how
There
I
you
like
go.
my music all
You
day.
got you got basketball, soccer, and a three-fer on the music.
Oh,
Good
yes.
recommendations for everybody today. Okay, so Lynn, before we get into what's going on right now, let's just get these folks to know who your organizations are. So, Darla, what's the National Network for Youth?
Yeah, so we're a national organization. We are a membership organization. We partner with over 300 youth homelessness service providers across the country. We also partner with young people who've experienced homelessness. We're looking to prevent and end youth and young adult homelessness across the country. We do that through advocacy. We do it through training and technical assistance to communities and by centering young people and all of that work and all the work that we do. And the organization's older than me. The older I get, the more excited I am about that. So the National Network for Youth is 51 years old.
51. And Barissa, what's Youth in Need? What do you guys provide to the St. Louis community?
Yeah, so Youth in Need is a nonprofit in St. Louis. So we work with and serve youth and families in the St. Louis area. And we have several programs that do that, from early Head Start programs like for early learning. And then we also have like foster care and adoption, counseling programs in schools and office based, and then residential programs that actually house youth and, help them find safety and long-term housing options. And then also that encompasses the street outreach program within all those programs as well that we'll talk about.
Yeah, no, excellent. So you guys are really kind of a multifaceted continuum of things. It's like you're in the runaway and youth homelessness, but you're in a lot more than that.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So Darla, what we're talking about today is the federal runaway and homeless youth program, so to speak. Let's start there. What does that federal program fund? Who does that work? And how long has this been around?
Yeah. So it's been around as long as the National Network for Youth. So it's 51 years old. Its origin is in the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act. Our origin is actually in trying to decriminalize status offenses. So that's anything that's illegal just because you're under the age of 18. So being a runaway, truant, out past curfew. So the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act is actually Title III of the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, but it's administered at the Administration on Children and Families within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And it's federal funding direct to local nonprofits or government agencies. And there's 4 primary buckets of direct service grants that the Administration on Children and Families administers. So first is the Basic Center Program. That's the initial program that was funded back in 1974. The goal of that is to provide short-term crisis housing to minors who would otherwise be in another system like child welfare or juvenile justice. When it's safe and appropriate, there's an emphasis on family reunification, but it's definitely short-term crisis housing with intensive supportive services. And then there's the transitional living program. That's longer-term housing with supportive services, a lot of emphasis on education, family reunification when it's safe, and that's for 16 to 22-year-olds. And then there's the maternity group home, which is transitional living with all the supportive services, 16 to 22-year-olds for pregnant and parenting young people. And then there's the street outreach program, which is actually in statute called the Sexual Abuse Prevention of Runaway and Homeless Youth. Unfortunately, 1 in 5 young people experiencing homelessness are trafficked for sex, labor, or both. So the purpose of the street outreach program and its origin was really to outreach to young people who are on the streets, connect them to services, and to prevent them from sexual assault, sex trafficking, and any type of harm. And so those are the primary grants that go direct to local government. It also funds 1-800-RUNAWAY, which is our national hotline, text, chat, call 24/7, and that connects young people to services. It also connects young people to parents and does family reunification that way. And then it also funds training and technical assistance, and it allows for demonstration grants as well as research whenever Congress funds it.
So safe to say that a lot of what you just described is carried out by grants that the federal government makes, and probably, I'm guessing, the states kind of bring some money to the table for as well, and it's done by nonprofit providers like the one that Barissa works for, like Youth in Need. Is that pretty much how it all?
The funding amounts are small, but the goal is that then there's kind of these good federal standards for best practices for serving runaway and homeless youth, street connected
Mhm.
young people. And all of our providers have to bring in other funding. A lot of our providers, yeah, they're bringing in maybe state and local dollars, but they're also doing fundraisers, galas, golf outings. I mean, they're doing all sorts of things to raise money to fill the gap so that they're actually able to fund the services that the federal law requires them to provide.
Would this be the right way to look at it from somebody that's not totally familiar with this kind of space? That there's, like a lot of nonprofits, everybody does everything they can to hustle up enough dollars to do everything they want. And
Yeah.
those may vary. Your gala does great one year, maybe it
Yeah.
doesn't do so great. States are notoriously have to change gears a lot. But the federal investment in these programs is sort of like a not a ton of money, but just steady Eddie
Yep.
baseline to keep this stuff going.
Absolutely. It's steady. And we really see it as it's setting a national standard of how these programs should be operated and the approach that should be taken in serving runaway youth, youth experiencing homelessness, youth at risk of homelessness. Yep.
Gotcha. Okay, so Barissa, you have been involved, I'm sure, in probably much more than this, but directly with one of the things that Darla just described, which is the street outreach program. And we'll talk a little bit more about like what's going on this year with it, because the Trump administration has kind of proposed a significant shift that has some advocates kind of nervous about the future of it. But let's just first try to get, our listeners to understand really what this work is. So what does it mean to be out there on a street outreach team, engaged with young people who are either, on the streets living there or on the streets all day and going wherever. So what's that work like?
It's definitely crisis work. So young people in crisis. Some it could be young people that you've encountered before. It could be young people that you've never encountered before. It could be a 10 to 15-second interaction, or it could be a 5-hour interaction. It really just varies on the day, the situation. But what's consistent is that as a street outreach worker, the services that we provide, the calmness that we walk into a situation with, the strategies that it takes to navigate some of the very difficult things that you're hearing or seeing. We are interacting with some of the most vulnerable youth in very vulnerable situations. And some of it is a first time for them. And sometimes it is they've been doing this for months, years, and you can't even fathom like what they've experienced. And you're just now in those environments. So we get calls. We go out we run into youth on the streets while we're outreaching. So when people say outreach, that can be very different in different settings. For us, that is like really strategic canvassing of areas that where we know that, whether that's because other youth have told us this is where they've been and congregate, or whether we've experienced because we have found a lot of youth in those areas, or whether it's law enforcement that have called us to help. There's so many different avenues that people can get in contact with us. And it's also our responsibility to help find and locate those young people. And that's really the essence of our job, to try to locate as many young people as we can that are in situations that are unsafe, and also provide a lot of community education for others that maybe are not in those situations, but can help inform us of like where to go to find and locate those youth, because at that point we have to build rapport. So once you're in those situations, it's building rapport to try to figure out what's the next steps. What this young person is needing, what this young person already has access to, what they don't have access to. So it takes a lot of time to navigate, and I could talk all day about it.
No, thank you. I appreciate that breakdown. So it sounds like it's kind of a mix of hearing from others via the hotline or however you would get, direct calls to you about something that somebody's worried about or has seen in the community. You guys building up a knowledge base over time of like, we know where kids are out on the street hanging out and congregating, and then canvassing to make sure the new spots or whatever and find like
Absolutely.
that. Yeah,
And that's like part one. Because then it's like
one.
that's just accessing the young person. Because then once you're actually like in front of the young person, then that's a whole nother another part. Because then you have to kind of navigate now needs, like what needs they have, what situation they're in. Like I said, a lot of the youth we have experienced trafficking, have experienced abuse and neglect, have maybe been homeless, for several years or multiple times in a short period of time. So it is navigating what's next.
What's your secret sauce on the rapport front? Like, how do you get a youth to engage with you, and sort of where do you take it from there when you're? I would imagine that differs whether it's a new kid or somebody that you've known for years. But
absolutely, I think that's honestly that's a skill. Like, not anybody can be a street outreach worker, because building that rapport in a very short amount of time. Sometimes all you have, like I mentioned, is like 10 seconds, and you can make or break a relationship. Like, it can go either way based off of that very short amount of time.
What do you do? What do you do if you only have 10 seconds? Like, what is it?
You only have 10 seconds. I think being calm, because, of course, when someone's in crisis, the last thing you want to do is be razzled.
Right. Yeah.
So always approaching something in a very calm way. You want to find information, but you don't want to ask too many questions to the point it feels like you're interrogating a young person. You want to make them comfortable. We all want to feel respected. We all want to feel cared for. We all want to feel like we can trust the person we're talking to. So I think it's just coming in, being very genuine, not overpromising anything, explaining what your role is, who you are to that young person, because unfortunately, a lot of the young people that we do experience have had not the best interactions with the adults in their lives that were supposed to be there to teach them things, to care for them, to protect them. A lot of times we're not able to, for various reasons that, that we may or may not get into. But so be understanding that, being very trauma informed, walking into the situation and knowing that, some youth might tell you their whole life story in 10 seconds, and some youth are very hesitant. So you kind of got to go off also what the youth is giving you and what they're not giving you, and not push too much too fast to kind of navigate that.
I'm sure you have more than one in your experienced career here, but is there, an engagement you had on the street with a young person that really sticks in your mind as sort of like, this is why I do this? And,
Oh, absolutely. I have several over the years, but to give you an example, Youth in Need is the regional provider for the Safe Place program. So we have these black and yellow signs on a lot of like the gas stations, like Quick Trip, Walgreens, fire stations, and such. And that's a national program and we educate the community and youth that whenever you're in a crisis, you can walk into these 24 hours a day.
Right.
I remember getting a call. It's about 2:00 in the morning. Like I said, this is a 24-hour service. We respond we respond 24 hours a day. 2 a.m., as a street hours worker, we're tired. This is middle of the night. So being on call is definitely part of our lives. I walk into the Quick Trip and I see a young lady. She has no shoes on. She has visible marks on her body, like looking like maybe she was in a struggle, hair kind of all over the place. She's in the back area because that's kind of the procedures that we've trained, staff to kind of get them out of, public and, in a private space. So the staff are razzled. When I walk in, the staff at the gas station are razzled. They're not really sure like what's going on. They didn't ask me questions. They just kind of offered her food, drink, and kind of let her wait for our arrival. So as I walk into the back of the store, she looks very startled once I even walk in. So this is one of those moments that you're asking, like, with that first interaction, I noticed that. Like, I noticed my presence even made her uncomfortable, made her tense up, made her razzled.
Yeah.
So being very aware of that, I keep my distance. I don't get too close, and I just calmly ask her, can you tell me what's going on? I introduce myself, I work for Youth in Need and I'm here to help you, and she at that point says, I don't want any help. I just need a shower, and some food. And I said, we can help you with that. Do you mind giving me, any information, as far as like your name, how old you are? And she was very hesitant. She didn't want to give any information. And I was okay with that. And at that point, just sat on the floor, you know. She sat on the floor. She kind of monitored, like mirrored what I was doing because she was standing. We're all kind of distance. I sat on the floor and just kind of connected. We started talking about something totally different. Like we started talking about the food she was eating and what's good at Quick Trip. Just kind of just relaxing in that environment because it's not a rush. It is very urgent, but building that time and that rapport to be able to make someone feel comfortable and also not feel pressured because it's a big step for a young person to ask for help or even access any help. And I recognize that. So the last thing I want to do is make it feel like, you're pressured to give information. After about 20 minutes or so, we start talking more and she starts sharing actually what's more going on. And come to find out she's not from St. Louis. Her aunt lived in St. Louis and she came here to live with her aunt because her mother was in a domestic violence situation and she didn't feel safe at home. So she ended up coming to St. Louis to live with her aunt. Things didn't really go as planned. And then she ended up running away from aunt's house, getting in a situation with a man that she met on the streets, kind of hanging out, thought it was a boyfriend situation, and turned out to that after a couple months of her dating this guy, he began to traffic her. It happened slowly and gradually. In order for her to keep staying with him, she had to exchange sex with other people that he would find and bring into the home. And that was kind of like her paying her dues for being there. So we talked about that. And in those type of situations, we don't judge, we don't pressure, we try to just ask questions of as much as you give. And we ended up getting her into like our shelter. She was willing to go to our shelter. And it was a long process because of all the trauma she had been through and the situation of what happened even prior to us even making contact with her. She was unsure of how to even navigate services. But eventually, we got counseling in our shelter. She was able to find a job. She was able to, of course, get out of that situation and find safety, and was able to get into long-term housing programs and finish high school and go to college and have somewhat of a normal young adulthood. But it took several years to do that.
It sounds like you're still in her life if you know all that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Fortunately, we are a program that no matter where a young person is, that we're able to follow them, whether shelter they go to, whether they go home, they're on the streets. That's the beauty about street outreach. And that's why I love it so much, because it's not a ending relationship at one time. It's something that's ongoing. And whether you need us or not, like I said, it's something you can pick up and kind of start over.
But it's got to be mentally tough, because for every case like that where you're still in contact, it sounds like, with this young woman, there must be so many that you see on the ride somewhere where you just wonder what happened, or
yeah, absolutely,
who you see out there on the street again.
Yeah, and I call that planting seeds.
Yeah.
We plant seeds, because we don't always see. Like I said, I was lucky enough, still have a relationship with her now, and she's older, a job, has her own kids at this point in her life, and I was able to see that. But there's many that 10-second interaction, maybe turns into an hour, but then after that day, there's no more contact, and you just hope that the little interaction that you had, the services that you provided or gave, will last long enough that they're able to find help from somewhere else, or that they're okay.
So let's kind of break down the whole picture of like what has been irregular this year. And I want to start, Darla, by having let's get a baseline. Okay. Just generally, there's about $146 million every year that goes out from the federal government to support the things that we've been talking about here.
Yep.
What is the process for that money getting out the door? Tell people from sort of that NOFO till people getting money in their accounts to do the work, like how this goes and how long everything takes.
Yeah. So typically, the Family and Youth Services Bureau, or FISB, within the Administration on Children and Families, or ACF, usually in the spring will release the Notice of Funding Opportunities, or NOFOs. And it's always basic center, transitional living, maternity group home, and street outreach. Now, there's a couple of off years where there isn't a competition, but when it's a competition year, which it is this year, is a competition year, then they're released in the spring. The deadline is the summer. And then grantees usually find out September 30th or maybe the day before, September 29th, if they've gotten another grant. And grants are anywhere from 3 to 5 years in length. So in a typical cycle, there's current grantees where they're still in cycle for their 3 to 5 year grant. And so around 60%, it just depends on the year, is going to renewal grants. And about 40% is when current grants are up for renewal, or you have a lot of other organizations and programs that aren't current grantees or that maybe had lost a grant in a previous cycle that are competing. And competition is tight. I mean, folks will score 99 out of 100 and not get funded because the 146 million is very tiny compared to the need and compared to the amount of communities that want to serve this population.
Within the process you described, so the NOFO usually goes out in the spring, and usually it's around the end of the fiscal year that people find out if they are one of the grantees. How long do you have once the notice comes up, usually, to get your stuff together, submit your materials, and then once that, like, so take that part, and then once those applications are all in, usually, like, how long and what's involved in that federal sort of review process for people?
Yeah.
No.
So grantees typically have 60 days. That's pretty standard. And that's how it's been the last, few cycles that we went back and looked at. Basically, once the NOFO was released, there was 60 days until the NOFOs and all the materials were required to be submitted. And then it goes through the grant review process at ACF. So there's the grants.gov folks, and then there's independent grant reviewers. And so there's usually multiple grant reviewers that will rank and score each application based on the criteria that was laid out in the NOFO. And then the kind of goes through the administrative process, like, do they meet the requirements? Are they financially sound? All these things. And then that list is developed by FISB staff, and then it has to go through ACF leadership. There's quite a few layers, right? So you have to go through their legal counsel, and then it has to go to the secretary's office. So there's bureaucracy. And then typically, they'll let senators know, hey, we're funding your constituents. And then the senators are announcing, hey, I got you this money. And,
right.
And then so some of our providers actually find out first from their senator that they've gotten a grant or not.
So that's regular old year in the world of runaway and homeless youth funding. Let's start with the timelines for this year, because they are significantly different. And I should say, Darla and I have talked about it, and I'll drop a link to our story about this in the show notes for this podcast. Just a growing concern, not just by runaway and homeless youth advocates, but a lot of different people in the youth serving space, that just we're running out of time to get a lot of youth funding out the door here. So in the course of us talking about that, they did finally put some notices up, and that's really like the starting gun, right? Is just having it out there in the world. So what is different about the timelines, and what is different about the available grants this year?
Yeah. So the first big thing is July 9th is whenever FISB put out the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act NOFOs. And they put it in the evening of July 9th. So technically, providers have 14 days, including weekends, but practically it's really just 13 days because they literally put it out. But we were being generous and saying, that they gave providers 2 weeks when typically they have 60 days. That in and of itself is alarming, and we're pretty sure violates law, the CFR that actually requires that grantees have 30 days to respond to grant applications. So we've been talking to Hill staff about that. The other layer is that there is no street outreach program as a standalone program. So if you're one of the over 50 street outreach programs where your grant ends September 30th, 2025, you cannot apply for just a street outreach program, NOFO, like you have in the past. They have collapsed the street outreach program into the transitional living program and maternity group home NOFOs as mandatory. And like Barissa and I were talking about earlier, maybe you're a transitional living program and a maternity group home that also has a street outreach program, but maybe not. Maybe your skill set and your expertise is in housing, service provision, education, employment connection for runaway and homeless youth. But now you're being required to provide street outreach, to hire street outreach staff to run a street outreach program. And in the NOFO really loses the essence of the street outreach program, which again is to prevent the sexual abuse, sexual exploitation of runaway and homeless youth. You don't see that in the NOFO. Also, for the Basic Center program, that NOFO is out again, 14 days. And there is an option of also applying for a street outreach program. So that is an optional addition. So the street outreach program, NOFO, gone. If you're a grantee that only had your street outreach program expiring, there is no street outreach program money for you to apply for as a standalone grant. You would have to apply for transitional living program or maternity group home or basic center program. I guess you'd have to, open a new housing program to also try to get a little bit of additional street outreach program money. Within 14 days, you'd have to try to create a new program in order to do that, which is very concerning. So that's just like timeline concerns. There's also other major shifts within the NOFOs. And also previously, whenever there has been anticipated changes to NOFOs, FSBE has kind of prepped grantees, done webinars, done training, provided support either before the NOFO is out or after the NOFO is out and say, hey, this is different. These are some trainings. We have the Runaway and Homeless Youth Training and Technical Assistance Center that's funded by the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. And grantees are given support in navigating any type of new mandates or shifts or requirements or standards that have come out around the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program. There are lots of new requirements and changes. There's no support. There's been no guidance. And federal program officers aren't really even allowed to comment. So how ACF and FSBE is run under the current administration is very alarming, very different, and I think very disrespectful to service providers and the amazing work that they do every day.
I've kind of two more in the weeds questions about the street outreach component of what you just said. But before I get to those, when we first talked about this, you had a real concern that this money would even get competed and spent.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still have that worry? Or at this point, all the issues you just surfaced aside, do you feel pretty confident that we're going to have grantees this year?
No, I do not feel confident. When you look at the new requirements, like an MOU with law enforcement, who can get an MOU with law enforcement in 14 days? I mean, it very much feels like they have set providers up to fail, required a bunch of new mandates that don't even make sense for the program in such a short time frame. To me, the way that they're treating this program and the providers that provide this work is they're just setting them up to fail. It seems like a setup. Because if you really wanted federal money to go to serve young people, you really wanted to prevent young people from trafficking, severe assault, you really had the best interests of young people in mind, this is not how you administer a program.
Darla's kind of laying out the 50,000 foot view of this across the country. You are, like we said, on the front lines here, working. I'm sure you prefer to just keep your head down and do the work and not worry about big picture, how the national funding picture looks. but I'm sure you guys are having conversations about this at Youth in Need. What's that like? Like, what is this all feeling like? And are there contingency plans in place? Like, what's the conversation at Youth in Need like right now about everything that's happening with these notices?
Yeah, it's scary times, I would say. It's very concerning. As Darla mentioned, like the way that the NOFOs are coming out and how street outreach is clumped in them, like, and it's not a standalone long program. It's not possible to do street outreach with it just being it's like clumped in, and it's so like I mentioned before, it's a specialized skill and training that it takes to even be a street outreach worker. Things change so much. Like you have to have the knowledge, you have to have the experience, there's so many different connections and relationship building that it takes, and it's losing that. And in the story that I mentioned earlier, the young person, she did go to a shelter. But that's not the story of so many other young people. We work with so many youth that are either unable to go to shelters, refuse to go to shelters.
Might go home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or at home in unsafe situations, or still with that boyfriend that is trafficking them and not ready to leave the situation, or able to get help, or is fearing for their life. So we're not able to do that work in the way that it's meant to be done. I'm very afraid for the future of the youth in our community more than our jobs, to be honest, because this is what we do. And we do it so that the most vulnerable youth and the most hard to reach youth have safety and the support. And so those conversations that we're having now, with this being a threat to to be clumped into MGH programs, Basic Center, and things like that, is, I mean, yeah, we have our heads down. We're going to keep doing the work. We're going to do the work regardless. But what does it look like as far as pivoting, as far as funding? Like, we're blessed. Like, Youth in Need has been around 50 years. Like, we are blessed that we are able to provide service, and we have been provided service for so long. But the realization is that we can't do it by ourselves. So even if we're able to still maintain our agency, our funding, but then two other agencies within St. Louis are not able to anymore or provide the same services, we can't. We do so many collaborations and so much that is needed. We don't have enough beds to even house or even support a lot of young people and provide the services. So it's not even a threat to us, it's a threat to any of our other counterparts that are also doing the work of even sustaining and able to serve as many youth as we can.
I really appreciate your perspective on that so much, because it kind of made me realize, or like, I hadn't really considered it in this way, but positioning it in the way that they're doing, right? Saying you're competing for these residential based shelter programs with the expectation that street outreach is going to be part of it, really implies the premise that the street outreach is a feeder for those programs. And like what you're saying is that happens for sure, but it's not nearly all the cases. For
Absolutely.
It's yes, some you might interact with a kid on the street who's pregnant, and they may go to a maternity group home. They may not. You may figure out a way.
Or they might leave tomorrow.
Or they might leave tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something. So Darla, like, are we in fait accompli mode now, or do you see a way? Like, who could influence this? Obviously, I guess the administration could change their mind and rewrite things. Have you had conversations with anybody there in the last week? Anybody in Congress interested here?
Well, the leadership at ACF has refused to meet with me because I'm not a state or local government. So obviously, I represent young people and service providers, which we would hope the administration would care about, as they are responsible for dispersing funds to help young people and to providers. But we've been in conversations with Senate offices, and Senate offices have been reaching out to the Administration on Children and Families about the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program. They're not getting a lot of response. And so I've heard from folks on the Hill that, trying to talk to and work with HHS is one of the toughest federal agencies to try to get a response from under this administration. They've had easier times with leadership in other federal agencies. Unfortunately, our law for the street outreach program, the law has street outreach program as a separate program, but it says may instead of shall. So a lawsuit wouldn't maybe cure part of the problem, but we do think a lawsuit around the 14-day versus 30-day, because we do believe they are violating federal regulation that does require that people have 30 days to respond to federal grant opportunities, and they've only provided 14. But with a Supreme Court ruling and taking away injunctive powers, you really would need a class action lawsuit to get any type of cure. And so we were just speaking to lawyers yesterday, but like, okay, so if we did sue over, to try to get 30 days instead of 14, what is the solution that the courts could even provide us in light of the Supreme Court ruling taking away that injunction power that had been being used before? So we're in a tough spot. Honestly, we're relying on members of Congress to really reach out and push back against this administration to try to get a longer time frame for grantees, to at least have that 30-day minimum that is in current federal law. So that's really what we're focused on now. But I know that members of Congress are pretty frustrated by just the lack of responsiveness and kind of willingness to work that they've been encountering at HHS in general.
The imprint has published a piece on this that I will drop in the show notes. I'll drop some other materials that the National Network for Youth has come up with on this topic. And we will continue to cover what's going on here. But for today, Darla Bardine, Executive Director, National Network for Youth, and Barissa Ford from Youth in Need in St. Louis. Thank you guys so much for joining me on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you to Darla Bardine of the National Network for Youth and Barissa Ford of Youth in Need in St. Louis, Missouri, for joining us today. And thank you to the National Association of Counsel for Children for sponsoring this episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. We'll have a link for people who might be interested in attending their annual conference, which is coming up in August in Cleveland, Ohio, in the show notes for this episode. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we'd really appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.